Hi, everyone. Hello, and welcome to the conversation series about Oxfam's work in responding to COVID-19. Thank you to all of the supporters, donors, allies, activists, everyone who is joining the call tonight. My name is Sarah Kupovic, and I'll be facilitating the conversation. Before I get into the brief kind of housekeeping and the presentation, I actually wanted to start the call by mentioning a few moments of hope or inspiration that some of you submitted with your registration today, that you have witnessed in the last couple weeks. So I'm just going to start by reading a couple of those here tonight. So from Martin, who shared, "I witness people willing to live without the comforts of everyday life to save strangers they'll never meet." And from Donna, who said, "Air and noise pollution have plummeted, and they hope this translates into having people work from home as much as they can in the future." And one more that I want to mention from Misato, who wrote in, "Virtual gatherings like this one provides greater opportunity of learning wherever you are." So thanks so much to you three and everyone who shared these thoughts with us. We love bringing them up with you all to share these glimpses of inspiration, but we'll also be sending them around to our team members internally at Oxfam, and I know it'll help to bring a smile to some more faces at our organization. I know for a lot of us, these virtual gatherings are bringing together not just coworkers anymore, but families and friends, and I'm so glad that you are all in this virtual space too. It's likely yet another video call on your schedule this week, but we're so grateful for you to be here building community with us and with each other. So today the presentation will be about 15 minutes. Please type your questions or comments into the chat box at any time during the presentation. We will also be recording this dialogue, and you'll get a link to that recording via email tomorrow. We're also keeping everyone on mute to ensure the best audio quality for everybody. Of course, feel free to chat in your questions into the chat box. If you're just joining by audio tonight, you can of course email me any questions or feedback that you have. And as a short intro for anyone who might be a fairly new supporter, Oxfam is an international anti-poverty organization that works in more than 90 countries. We save lives in times of disaster and conflict. We campaign for social change, and with partners on the ground, we develop long-term solutions to poverty and injustice. We hope you continue to support the work in the numerous ways that we know you already do. This conversation series for the month of April will tackle Oxfam's response to COVID-19, both globally around the world and here in our own backyards in the USA. The dialogue today will be spotlighting our climate efforts in the midst of this public health crisis. We'll hear from two Oxfam staff who are close to this work. Lauren Stewart is our Associate Policy Advisor on our climate team in our Washington, D.C. office. And you'll also hear from Maria Concepcion, our United States Domestic Program Manager in Puerto Rico. So now I'd like to pass the mic over to Lauren, who will get us started today on the updates we have for everyone.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you again to all of you who are joining us tonight for this webinar. Now, before I jump into talking about some of the connections between climate change and COVID-19 and how it's impacting our climate work here at Oxfam America, I just want to start off by saying that the main reason we care so deeply about climate change is because it's a problem rooted in inequality. It impacts people's lives and livelihoods, and people suffer as a result. And so while right now our immediate priority is helping those who have been affected by this pandemic, we also know that the climate crisis hasn't gone away and people are still suffering from the impacts. However, we also recognize that our climate work will be more important than ever in the coming months in order to ensure that we build back better and recover from this crisis in a sustainable way. I'm going to talk a little bit more about our work in just a minute, but first I want to highlight some of the big picture connections between COVID-19 and climate change. And I think one of the most important connections that we've seen so far is how COVID-19 and climate change both expose and exacerbate the inequalities that are deeply rooted in our society. We've seen how COVID disproportionately impacts those who are poor and marginalized, and this pandemic has been a terrible reminder that, in general, vulnerable populations are hit hardest by crises, and this includes the climate change crisis. And so in order for us to reduce suffering from any crisis in the future, we have to address not only the crisis itself, but also the inequalities that fuel the vulnerability. Another point that I want to highlight is that COVID-19 has shown us that our world was extremely unprepared for a transboundary crisis of this magnitude. And that should be a warning sign for future crises, including climate change. However, this pandemic has also shown us that governments do, in fact, have the capacity to quickly mobilize massive amounts of resources in order to address a global threat. And it's also shown us that large-scale collective action for the greater good is actually possible. And we've known for a long time that in order to address the climate crisis, we need to do both these things. We need to mobilize massive amounts of resources, and we need to take global collective action. However, we never knew that this was possible up until now, and this pandemic has shown us that. And I think that this is really important to keep in mind as we move forward towards the recovery phase of this crisis. And the last connection that I want to highlight is how COVID-19 has shown us that early action guided by science is absolutely crucial in order to save lives and avoid even more devastating consequences. And you know, climate scientists have been warning us for literally decades that urgent and ambitious action is needed to address the climate crisis. Yet these experts and the fundamental physics and science behind these warnings have largely been ignored. And I think that this pandemic is a realization for a lot of people that if we want to avoid the most devastating consequences of the climate crisis, if we want to save lives and livelihoods, and if we want to reduce suffering, then we need to put our trust in science, and we need to listen to the experts, and we need to take urgent action now. So these connections between COVID-19 and climate change are really important for us to keep in mind as we pivot and adapt our work in climate policy. So for those of you who maybe aren't quite as familiar with our climate policy work, our team focuses primarily on global solutions that not only help mitigate climate change, but also help to build resilience to its impacts. So for example, we advocate for more ambitious international climate actions, such as the Paris Agreement. We push global actors to invest in clean energy. We are developing policy recommendations for a feminist Green New Deal, and we are establishing a leading voice on climate migration. So we do a lot of climate work, and I think it's important to note that a lot of this work still continues despite the ongoing pandemic crisis. And that's because, like I said, climate change hasn't gone away just because we are dealing with COVID-19. But in light of this pandemic, we are adapting and pivoting our work to reflect our new reality. And I think that one of the most significant ways that we have shifted our work is to focus on recovery advocacy. So for example, we are advocating for a climate-friendly and sustainable economic recovery that increases resilience to future crises, but also stimulates the economy by creating green jobs. We're also pushing Congress to not bail out oil companies and to provide recovery funds to support fossil fuel workers in a just transition to clean energy. And while there's obviously nothing good about a pandemic, no matter how you look at it, we do recognize that crises are opportunities to build back better. And in this case, it's also an opportunity for us to build back greener and build back more resilient. Another way where we have pivoted our work a bit is on defending and strengthening international climate action. So 2020 was supposed to be a really big year for international climate action because countries are expected to increase their ambition of their emission reduction targets under the Paris Agreement. However, because of COVID-19, we're worried that the momentum we had going into this year might be threatened, and that countries could use this pandemic as an excuse for weaker climate action instead of more ambitious action. So I think that right now our advocacy work is more important than ever to ensure that the climate crisis is not forgotten on the global stage, and that countries are committing to recovering in a way that is compatible with the goals of the Paris Agreement. If this is something you are interested in, and if you want to help push the global momentum to address climate change, then I encourage all of you to join the Earth Day climate strikes, which start tomorrow, and of course they're going to be held virtually. I think we are adding a link in the chat box, so you can go there and you can find out more information about how to engage in these strikes over the next couple of days. So before I wrap up, I'm almost done, I just want to highlight one more area of our work where we are adapting in the context of COVID-19. And like I said, a lot of our work is very global in nature, but our work with indigenous communities in the Amazon, where we work on mitigating climate change and defending their land rights, is a really good example of how our global work impacts local communities as well. And in the Amazon region of Brazil, there have already been over 1,800 cases of COVID-19 reported so far. And so we're working with global and regional partners to support these local communities. And we're doing that by calling for a temporary ban on all mining, logging, and oil extraction activities in order to limit the spread of the virus. And we're also advocating for adequate healthcare services to protect these communities as well during this pandemic. So I know I've said a lot, but I am going to hand it over to Marina now, who is going to talk a little bit more about the local connections between climate change and COVID-19.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for your great work there. And thank you for giving us a better idea of what's happening at the federal level, because that work that you're doing is so important for territories like Puerto Rico. Build Back Better, resiliency, and creating a green economy are really providing real sustainable solutions for our island. I wanted to start a little bit by talking tonight about our most recent numbers for Puerto Rico on COVID. And first and foremost, as I keep doing more of these, I always want to also take a moment to really thank our public health specialists who are working beyond their call of duty to help us. Currently in Puerto Rico, we have, as of this evening, we have 64 deaths. We have around 915 positive cases. Testing has been conducted to over 11,000 people, and we have results pending to about almost 2,000. Like in other places of the world, we don't have enough testing in Puerto Rico. Testing isn't dependable, and hospitals here, while not crowded, are really not equipped to handle an increased amount of respiratory illnesses. I like to always start our conversations with these amounts because, as you know, Puerto Rico is now facing a pandemic on top of natural disasters and climate change challenges. And what that means for us is that access to water continues to be precarious. You know, droughts continue to will certainly affect our water supply this summer. Power plants and the increased use of energy also contributes to our water shortage, as millions of gallons of potable water are used daily, and hundreds of millions of gallons of seawater are also used daily to cool boilers, for example. Here throughout the island, we have pre-existing health conditions that are higher than in other places. Asthma is twice as high here than in the US, and our asthma rates and respiratory illnesses are affected by genetic and environmental factors. The recent stress that we're feeling and the psychosocial stress of these multiple disasters, whether it's at the individual, family, or community level, is definitely affecting our public health and influencing our asthma and our asthma morbidity. Social isolation, anxiety is also increasing our onset of asthma. So as more and more community members are being affected by the pandemic and by the multiple disasters, including, as you know, our recent earthquakes, that have taken us out of our homes and into informal shelters. Climate change continues to aggravate our recovery ability. This, coupled with vital infrastructure in the island that continues to be interrupted, is affecting our daily lives. So as we think about how to recover from this recent pandemic and how to look towards the future and how to bring back reasonable conversations around climate change, we need to think about that $2 trillion that's coming in and how we can use this effectively. So we want to make sure that we have an economic recovery that is designed in a way that uses a socio-economic climate change lens. You know, we know that COVID-19 requires an immediate response at the short, midterm, and long-term levels, but there's also responsibility to make sure that whatever federal funds come our way address the immediate public health needs and the infrastructure needs in a green way and with a long-term sustainable plan. Funds for the rebuilding of Puerto Rico, the earthquake, and now COVID need to construct a real sustainable green economy and bring employment opportunities for the most vulnerable. Throughout the recent months and since our time here in Puerto Rico, we have been able to demonstrate how local humanitarian leadership in the island has been vocal in identifying local solutions to global problems. Our local partners have the knowledge and the resources they need to lead in their communities. Our work on the ground combines humanitarian response to build back a better future, reduce inequality, and increase resiliency. Partners like Casa Pueblo are pushing for a whole municipality in the central mountain region to go solar. Bosque Modelo and Coordinadora Paz para la Mujer are ensuring women are trained to enter the solar economy. And Proyecto Matria is making sure victims of domestic violence acquire the skill sets needed to also enter job markets and find jobs in the green economy. So I ask you to continue to engage with us in this climate change series. Tomorrow, you're going to have an opportunity, tomorrow, Wednesday at 5:22, you're going to have an opportunity to meet one of our women leaders on the front lines of climate change. Environmental attorney Ruth Santiago from our local Queremos Sol movement. She will address the current energy situation in Puerto Rico, make recommendations for local government to address climate change, and provide glimpses of some innovative ideas that local community-based organizations are working on here in Puerto Rico, like rooftop solar pilot projects that some of you have helped us fund. So please look out for the link that Sarah will be sharing with all of you in the chat. And I want to take it over to Sarah now and use the time for us to be available to answer any questions that you might have in the next session.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lauren and Maria. Yes, we shared the link in the chat box, and I'll also be sending that out in my email tomorrow. Maria, thank you for mentioning a little snapshot of who we can expect to hear from in partnership on the virtual climate strikes. That's exciting. So it's so interesting to see the overlaps between your two updates, including the layers of inequality faced by communities who are so vulnerable already to climate change impacts, rising sea levels, climate aggravated storms, etc., who are now also some of the most vulnerable to COVID-19. And this is what Oxfam has always worked on, the inequalities and barriers that people face, whether man-made or natural causes, to overcoming injustices and poverty in their lives. And also thanks to both of you for illustrating the clear need to keep the focus on climate in the recovery and rebuilding of economic systems, infrastructure, et cetera, to really ensure a greener and more equitable future for all. So we're going to segue now into the Q&A and discussion. Please continue to type in your questions, comments, and feedback into the chat box. Any that we don't get to tonight, we will be happy to respond to via email. So actually, I'd like to start with one that was submitted by a supporter in advance that I think is great to share with the full group, something that I think has been on a lot of our minds. So the question submitted was, what's the anticipated environmental impact of both deregulation under emergency declarations and future economic stimulus measures? Lauren, would you like to take that one?
Sure, thanks, Sarah. That's a really good question. And I think that's something, like you said, a lot of us are thinking about right now. And as we've seen over the past few weeks, a great example of deregulation is the Trump administration has been freezing environmental regulations at the EPA. And basically, they are allowing industries to pollute recklessly at this point, as long as they claim that their failure to meet environmental standards was caused by this pandemic crisis. And this is obviously extremely alarming in a lot of ways, and I think it really threatens to set back the environmental progress that we have made so far. But I think one of the things that worries me the most about this is that with these industries polluting more, that's going to decrease our air quality. And during a pandemic, you know, our air quality is really important to maintain our public health. And so I think that's one of the biggest problems that we could see as a result of the deregulation. As far as future economic stimulus measures, these could also have huge environmental consequences if we lock in future carbon emissions. And if we did this, then we would just be further exacerbating climate change. And that would be devastating from an environmental perspective, of course. We've seen the impacts of climate change and what that can do to our environment. But it's also devastating to think about what that's going to do to the vulnerable communities who are hit hardest by these impacts. And so that's why I think it's so important that we advocate for a sustainable recovery that not only stimulates the economy, but also lays the foundation for a greener future.
Great, thank you, Lauren. I actually have another question I think that came in early on in the chat box while you were speaking your general update that I want to highlight here. Theodora asks, what is a feminist Green New Deal? Would you be able to answer that, Lauren, and in how it relates to Oxfam's policy and advocacy work?
Yeah, I can touch on that briefly. I won't get into too many details, but basically the feminist New Deal, you know, we're just trying to approach climate change and a sustainable economy in a way that, you know, we recognize women, we recognize gender, we recognize those who are most vulnerable, we recognize everyone. You know, it's not just about women necessarily, but we recognize all of those who are most vulnerable, and we try to incorporate their needs into this Green New Deal. And from our perspective at Oxfam, we specifically are looking at the feminist Green New Deal from an international perspective. And our position is that there's no such thing as a domestic climate policy. You know, what the United States does as far as climate policy, and really with many different policies, it has global impacts. And so what we do to address climate change here, whether it's a feminist Green New Deal or whatever, you know, it's called, it's going to impact people across the world, particularly those who are most vulnerable. So, you know, and really what we're trying to get at is we want to incorporate the feminist perspective. We want to make sure that those who are most vulnerable are addressed, and we want to make sure that we are taking an international approach as well.
Great, thank you for addressing that. We have lots of questions coming in, and unfortunately I'll have to say now that we won't have time for all of them live. Please keep an eye out tomorrow for my answers to these questions tomorrow. I want to voice at least one more I think we have time for from the chat. So from Dr. Jim Godino, how does Oxfam work with the international groups of scientists and activists? Maria, did you say you could address this one?
Yeah, I would love to tell you a little bit more about who we work with in Puerto Rico. You know, when we arrived, when our program arrived to Puerto Rico, when Oxfam arrived 2 years ago after the hurricane, we were addressing water security and alternative energy. And so through that work, that area of work, we came across several strong community-based organizations. And one of those was the Puerto Rico Science and Technology Trust, which houses a Response Innovation Lab, which houses the Public Health Trust. We also worked with an important group of community doctors through another community-based organizations. So locally, there's a strong network of scientists that we work with. In the last year or so, we've started to also reach out to our colleagues at the United Space Research Associates, for example, to start using technology and mapping to find ways to mitigate climate change and to address risk reduction factors. So since day one, we've been able to work hand in hand with the medical community, but also with public health community leaders to really find the right solutions, and it's been good work. And somebody just typed in about the coquille frogs. I would like to apologize, but yes, there's no way of escaping that sound from where I'm at, and hopefully, you know, we can continue to mitigate climate change so we don't use that beautiful sound of the coquille frogs. Yeah.
Yeah, we love hearing them, Maria. It's not too much of a distraction. It's a nice background.
Okay.
Lauren, if you wanted to add anything on to that from a global perspective, outside of Puerto Rico or the US, the question was international groups of scientists and activists.
Yeah, as far as scientists go, I mean, in general, we engage with a lot of partners across the US and also internationally as well. As far as specific scientists, I mean, we make sure that all of our policies are grounded in best available science, data, and information. And so we heavily rely on reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and you know, we're always talking to partners, whether they're scientists or, you know, maybe they work in development. We're always engaging globally on these topics.
Great, thank you. And unfortunately, I believe that's all the time that we have tonight. We're quickly approaching our ending here. Thank you so much for the engagement. We will be recording all of the questions that have been submitted and following up. Before I tell you about next week's conversation, if you're wondering how you can help and you feel that you are in the position to do so, we hope you can pitch in with an emergency donation today, big or small, for those who need us most. You'll find the link to our donation page now or shortly soon in the chat box. And then next week on Thursday, April 30th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll have our next conversation in the series featuring COVID-19's implication of gender within Oxfam's work and in society at large. So you'll get to hear from Joy Owens, Oxfam's Senior Gulf Coast Policy Officer in Mississippi, as well as Dr. Husnia Al-Qadri from Oxfam's Gender Program Coordinator in Yemen. So thank you again, everyone who's joining us today on the call or listening to this recording later. Please feel free to send any lingering questions or thoughts to us at impactcircle@oxfamamerica.org or reply to our email that we send out the recording of the session tomorrow. Thank you, everyone, for your engagement today, your participation, and your partnership with Oxfam. I hope everyone continues to stay well. And Lauren, Maria, thank you so much for joining us. Is there any quick final closing thoughts or thanks that you want to share with the group?
No, I just wanted to say good night. Thank you for joining us, and really value everyone's commitment for allowing us and mitigate climate change in Puerto Rico. And I look forward to working with all of you.
Yeah, and I just want to thank everyone again for showing up tonight to support our climate change work. This is something I'm personally really passionate about, and I think a lot of my colleagues and a lot of you on this call are probably very passionate about that as well. So thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night. Take care.